So we've wrapped up most of the, well, we've wrapped up all the presentations for the last day and into today. So as I've indicated earlier, this now is an opportunity for some open discussion. And this is really for those folks that are online and anyone in the room as well. But I'd really like to bring in what we've heard from, or what people have been kind of thinking about or wanted to know more from the online audience. And so we've got some time here to address that, and I'll just turn it over to Nancy and just ask if we've got, first of all, are there any questions that people have wanted to follow up on? Okay.
2 questions came in while we were breaking. Another one from Susan Kaler, who has been dead on the entire time we've been doing this, so kudos to her. Question for those working on the mountain pine bark beetle. As the beetles kill the old trees, especially in drought conditions, does the incidence of forest fires increase, and how does this impact the beetle population in the subsequent years? Could this be affecting northern migration? Also, is there a correlation with increase in forest fires with the destruction of trees by any of these beetle species?
I guess I'll take that. Matt can chime in if he wants.
And can you
yes, sorry.
Yep, name
Jeff Hickey. So the answer is depends. The answer to is subsequent fire enhanced? Is the risk of fire enhanced following beetle outbreaks? And the answer is it depends. It depends on a few things, most principally the time since the outbreak. So the trees go through a period where the needles desiccate, but still on the trees. That's the red stage that you often see. We think, although it's hard to demonstrate, that that might be an increased fire risk. But for lots of species of trees, those needles fall off within a few years. And at that point, the amount of fuels in the canopy is reduced. And so we think then the canopy or crown fires, the risk of those is reduced. So it's a little bit depends on the time. And I forgot the other questions.
The other question was about fire. Does the incidence of forest fires increase, and how does this impact the beetle population in subsequent years?
Right, so I think I answered that about fire, maybe, although it's been hard. Beetle populations will be affected in the sense that the forest is now, the composition has changed, and so those old large trees that were killed are no longer around, and yet those are the ones that are preferred by mountain pine beetle.
Okay, next question's on a different topic. And this is going back to before lunch. Wondering if Paul Jepson, who's not here, and Scott Izard have comments about National Real-Time Pest Track and Prediction System. Currently, such systems are painfully balkanized at state, regional level. Diversity is great, but would be useful to have one consistently funded system. So that kind of goes back to that funding discussion.
So could you repeat that question again?
Given the differences, oh no, sorry, wrong one. Wondering if Scott has comments about National Real-Time Pest Track and Prediction System. Currently, such systems are painfully balkanized at state and regional level. Diversity is great, but would be useful to have one consistently funded system.
Yes. I mean, I think that speaks to a number of number of participants have made that point earlier. It's a challenge, especially in field crops. Well, in field crops, in that the real challenge is getting people to share information in real time. That another challenge there is the quality of the data that comes in. It varies tremendously in quality. I would hope in the near future that we can overcome some of those hurdles and have a nationwide system. We're working on it. but it's certainly not there yet. These systems now with automatic programming interfaces can link to other university-based systems, and we're doing that. A lot of systems now using ADMaps or Bugwood as a repository for pest information, and hopefully that will help the research community in general in the future. So we're working towards that, but I think it's painfully slow.
Okay, so online questions. We did have a rather lengthy comment from one participant, which I don't know. Do you want to just read that? I mean, we have some time here, and this person is obviously engaged in this discussion, which we really want to facilitate. So maybe you should just go ahead and read that.
Okay,
And
it's long.
and this is from.
This is from Glenn Kaler at the University of Maine.
Okay.
Not a question, just some takeaway points from Tuesday afternoon and Wednesday morning presentations that may be useful for discussion. There are robust predictions for generalized climate trend and pest responses. For example, hotter and drier some places, hotter and wetter others, higher CO2, faster pest development, northward range shifts and/or expansions. The climate change aspects seem much more predictable than the agricultural and pest responses. Unfortunately, generalized relationships don't always hold true at site and organism-specific levels at which agricultural and other land management occurs. The trends give us early warning for potentials we should be prepared for, but in many, if not most cases, we will have to wait and see what actually results from complex of multi-factor interactions. These complex interactions will undoubtedly lead to unexpected outcomes. For example, wheat blast introduction into Bangladesh arising from climate change impact on Russian wheat exports of 2010. Short-term need for economic returns constrain ability to adopt responses such as planting a diversity of drought-tolerant versus highest-yielding varieties. The short-term game is still to go to the biggest possible return versus the highest average return over a range of possible conditions. Experience with drought years might correct for that after a few costly experiences with the disadvantage of not spreading risk over a range of varietal potential and susceptibilities. Then again, crop insurance that buffers the cost of going for the highest yield may diffuse the pain stimulus and delay the concept of including climate risk within a single year's crop, variety, site, and plant timing decisions. The need for cross-disciplinary work continues to increase. The climate folks need to understand the type of information that the ag production folks need to plan for future crop and variety selection, location, pest management, water management needs. Ag subsidy programs, Farm Service Agency, and other financial support systems need to step back and rethink what are rational objectives within new physical and climatic context. Rational objectives will have to confront the inevitable inertia for continuing with what has always worked in the past. But the physical context of the past may change to the degree that requires breaking with historical precedent. For example, should we continue to grow cotton in Arizona? This realignment of supported objectives also extends to new national, international market, and even geopolitical contexts, but hard to get arms around that larger scale. i.e., how can we ever plan for another Arab Spring? We have too many immediate issues to address to even have to worry about that scale. The trends for impact of climate change on pests versus crops seems generally to favor increase in pest pressure and change. Pests, by nature, are adapted to faster reproductive and adaptive responses than crops. Then again, the revolution in genetic manipulation provides tools for accelerated crop development. But that only matters if the economic factors allow that to happen on both the creation side and on the farmer adoption/consumer side. If agricultural dynamism is increasing, the need for knowledge discovery and outreach communication will also increase. USDA already knows this quotes, future agricultural adaptation will occur in a decision environment characterized by high complexity and the increasing pace and intensity of climatic change, end quote, USDA 2012. Excuse me. Will the research and outreach network be funded to a level to meet these increasing challenges? Specifically, what is the 30-year outlook for land grant and extension funding? Or will the need to address accelerating agricultural dynamism be left to the individual profit motives of the private market? Leaving it to the private sector has potential consequences for short-term self-interest interfering with longer-term collective good. Preaching to the choir, and it's been said many times before, but once again, we see the need for the science community needs to help the public understand the need and value for knowledge. The above statements primarily deal with national scope, but climate and pests are not limited to national borders. Is there support for greater transnational cooperation in dealing with the climate ag pest realm, i.e. through UN or other international programs? What existing examples can we build on? Support will depend on showing economic returns for such cooperation. What work is being done to document such tangible returns in terms that politicians can relate to? Maybe the best comment of the morning was Jim Stack pointing out that a 4 centigrade increase seems trivial to the average person given a 12 centigrade swing across the arc of a single day. My numbers, not his. But World Bank 2012 report turned down the heat, predicted that a +4 centigrade increase in global average temperature would be, quotes, incompatible with an organized global community, is likely to be beyond adaptation, is devastating to the majority of ecosystems, and has a high probability of not being stable, end quote. Cheers, Glenn.
So there's the opening introduction to our paper, I suppose. And I appreciate that. I think that's obviously a thoughtful response and an interesting, some things in there. And the thing that kind of resonates, or that I heard, and I think this group is, working together, and that's been stated many times, but for the first time on a global scale, how does that happen? Because it's an issue that is really impacting a lot of areas that are experiencing it in different ways, and we happen to be addressing the pest aspect of the effects of climate. Just those are my thoughts, but if anyone else has some initial thoughts to this, to Glenn's comments, I would say feel free to share those at this point.
This is Jeff Dukes. I thought those were really interesting comments, and agree also with maybe it was Jim's comment earlier this morning about it being useful to have an economist in the room. It seems like so much of this problem is coupled to human decision making and the incentives that we as a society have in place for certain behaviors. And I wonder if there might be mechanisms through which crop insurance or I don't know, other sorts of incentives could be used to really ameliorate some of these problems, or accelerate incentivize the behaviors that we would want on behalf of companies developing new crops, farmers adopting them, or new crop varieties that are maybe well adapted to future conditions as well as current ones. Farmers adopting maybe a practice of planting a wider variety of climate-adapted cultivars in a given year, greater diversity on the landscape or something like this to minimize the potential for climate impact across a region. I don't know. I mean, I'm out of my depth here in terms of exactly what the policy solutions would be, and I would love to have to hear other people's thoughts on how we could really move forward to incentivize some of the behaviors and societal structures that we think would be most effective in adapting to the challenges that we're talking about.
We have a comment on the comment.
I should hook Glenn and Susan up together. This is from Susan Kaler again. Kudos to Glenn, I can't agree more. I'm glad that someone raised the crop insurance aspect. A lot of growers are making decisions based on crop insurance, and in fact would be growing crops better adapted to their climate if the crop insurance supported it. Kudos all around.
After that. Yeah, the insurance comment is a really good one. There's sort of, it's a two-edged sword. One of the really interesting things I ran across recently was a effort on the part of Swiss Re, which is an insurance company, reinsurance company. And what they've done is to incentivize farmers, small-scale farmers in Tanzania to adopt no-till as a means of controlling carbon loss from soils. And the way they did that was to promise them that if they took up this new practice, that they would ensure that they didn't go hungry, which is a pretty straightforward means of insurance. Now that's one aspect of insurance that I think can be very positive. On the other side, in 2012, even though they planted the normal corn and soybean type varieties, and almost everyone reported a loss that year, it didn't really matter. There was no incentive to change the crop, the typical corn soybean rotation, because everybody got insurance payments. So it again, it just depends on its use, and I think it can be a very effective tool, but it just depends on how it's implemented. And again, this goes back to the policy decisions, which again harkens back to a point that was talked about in Jim's presentation, and that is, how do we make those bridges? How do we get the science to communicate in a way that's effective with policymakers, so that they understand that we really do need to invest in research, ag research overall, and particularly research related to both managed and unmanaged systems for the U.S. and elsewhere. I'm always reminded of the amount of money that the Pentagon spends, something like $765 billion, I think, a year. And I would ask them, if I had someone in front of me, could we maybe spend 1% of that on ag research? Just 1%, because maybe if the next potential terrorist sat down to a full meal of, they wouldn't be quite as much of a threat in the future. Just a thought.
In regard to the crop insurance and everything, we've seen a lot of people here using the PRISM data set. Chris Daly's group has been working with the RMA for the last, I think, 5-6 years now, on actually bringing the climate data set into looking at crop risk, into when planting dates should occur, whether there was enough precipitation or whether there will be enough precipitation for the crop growth, and changing the premiums based on that risk, or even the payouts based on what was the probability of this event occurring that the grower said occurred. So that component is starting to move through the system.
Can I just ask, does anybody know if there's anything similar that has to do with risks having to do with pests and pathogens?
With risk due to pests and pathogens?
Yeah, in different regions for different crops, incentivizing different farmer behaviors, or essentially something like that.
I don't know of anything formal. I know we're starting a project right now of looking at tracking fungicide resistance within their Siphonocator population, and giving advice on what chemistries growers should or shouldn't be used based on the proportion of the alleles that are resistant. But that's all very developmental.
This is Matt. Part of the remarkable success of southern pine beetle management in the southeast is due to a program run by the U.S. Forest Service to incentivize landowners to thin their forests. And there's been many people who've participated in this program. And a nice feature of that is that the more acres of thinned, relatively low-risk forest that you have in a larger region, the lower the risk is for that whole region. And so it's actually very clear. There's strong evidence that is a contributor to the suppression of southern pine beetles in the southeast. It's a good success story.
Also, this is Scott Izard. As part of the soybean rust monitoring program, which for a while was funded by the RMA, there was a good farm practice, I think we called it a form or something, that growers could use to document their practices and following the commentary and guidelines that extension specialists in states were providing as part of this program, and they could then use that if they had to claim crop insurance for soybean rust. Now, there wasn't all that much. There probably weren't many cases in which growers did that, but that was something that the RMA did invest in.
Just to respond, I wonder, I mean, this is Jeff Dukes. I wonder if, well, to me, I'd be really interested in reading about some of these types of things that have been done and putting them in the context of climate change as well, and thinking about, you know, what policy levers are available that have been used for these sorts of things, and to what extent do they apply to increasing climate variability, and what climate levers or what policy levers are not being used at all, and you know, in an ideal world, do we see a panel of levers that we might use to actually get the behavior that we would think would be most rational from the 50,000-foot view, as opposed to from the 5.5-foot view or whatever. So anyway, that might be more for discussion for later, but.
Yeah, we actually, I had a conversation with Matt during one of the breaks about, you know, getting what we think is important to those folks that are making decisions and developing policy, and related to Jim's presentation as well. But one of the things, and Matt, you can add on to this or subtract if you want, but you know, the example that he gave was there was a group that he was involved in, and kind of along the same lines, academic related, you know, we know this, we know that. And when they got together, the first thing they talked about was not kind of what we're talking about here, which is, I think it's good for this group, but it was more, what is the way that we're going to get the message to the people that need to hear it? So it was marketing and promotion. And how do you do that first and then put the content in? And so Matt, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, and you know, to talk about that, but I thought that was really good, because it seems like that's where we're at as far as influencing, or you know, getting the information to folks that are in those positions. So.
Yeah, in that case, the question was how to prevent the next emerald ash borer, you could say, and the conclusion that was already evident from the science as we were starting the work group, which I was a small part of. It was led by Gary Lovett at the Carey Institute in New York, but it became obvious through our analysis. You can find this literature, open access paper. There's a bunch of good information on a website through the Carey Institute which I'll find the link to in a minute. But the solutions are going to take some laws, a few sensible legal approaches, and so my colleagues developed a plan to bring this science and this policy analysis not just to the public, which they did a very effective job. There were hundreds of different press coverages, and then use that as leverage to talk to various people on Capitol Hill. And this has been successful to date in that conversations and draft text is being developed for the so-called Farms Bill, which is probably 2 years away from coming into practice now, but that's progress. And Steve and I were noting that most of us don't have any training in how to affect lawmakers, but sometimes that's the pathway. And surely it's something we can become better at, especially with allies like people who are listening out there now. And so we're not very good at it now, so there's a long ways for us to improve. There's lots of opportunities.
Yeah. Go ahead. Turn your mic on, though.
Working through lawmakers is largely finding the larger grower co-ops, the corporations, and getting them on your side to do the lobbying. I've seen this successful several times, and working with that and getting that consortium, but it has to be a consortium. It can't be on a state-by-state basis. You've got to, especially now with the political climate changed in Congress, that it can't look like pork barrel. So it can't be a state. It has to be a large geographic region.
Right, and I think I had another conversation with somebody about advocacy. We can, as scientists, we can talk as much as we want, but if there's not someone else that's advocating for the work that we're doing, then it really is not going to go as far as it could or maybe should. And so I think that's, where do we find those groups to connect to, and how do we do that? And so I think that's, part of this, getting back to Matt's example and getting the message out. I tried to get some media representatives here, tried to say, come to this, we want to broadcast and let this be known, but no interest, to whatever reason, for whatever extent. I know there's an important political thing going on right now, so okay, maybe this is not a major thing in that realm, but I think that's valuable to say, okay, what the other groups that aren't here, so staffers, on the Hill, that would be another potential group that should be involved in this to relate that message, or to try and affect this policy issue that seems to be what we're kind of discussing at this point. So, yeah, Mike.
I'm surprised no one from the media wanted to attend. Anyway, I don't know how many of you work with your university or government communication groups, but I heard many, many really good stories here. Not publications, stories about the work. Bark beetles infesting, it's what's happening to our national parks. You turn it on and try to make it relevant. So I think there's some real opportunities, and I did mention to Nancy, there is a publication called The Hill that comes out when she was here. That comes out every day, and staffers read it, and I think there's opportunities there. I've published in it. It's not a scientific journal. It's like writing to your sister, but that's okay. But I think it's a real good way to get the word out as to what's going on, what the needs are, and can bring about change in policy, at least in getting people's attention. And you should do a TED Talk.
Most of us belong to one or more scientific, professional, some type of organization, and I know that many of the ones I belong to have very good policy staff, and they organize activities for staffers, et cetera. They have organized congressional visits from membership, And that's an avenue, if it's a very focused effort across several societies, that could be a good way to impact some of this dialogue.
If we had those folks in this room right now, what would we be asking them to do? What is the policy that we would like enacted?
So this is Jeff Olu, sorry. I mean, I agree. I think that's an important question, and I think that we can still easily get a message to the media or policymakers or whatever, but it will be very useful if it's condensed and if it is that focused message that we've decided on. This is what we want to tell them, and we package it in a way that is receptive. So it's like you were saying before, Steve, like, what is the marketing package essentially, right? We need to figure out, well, who's the audience that we actually want to hear this, and then what is the right vehicle to reach them best. And I think, it'd be great to have them here in the room, and maybe some of them are online, but we can do a better job of distilling and delivering what's going to be most useful for them and get the broadest audience through them, through our discussions over the rest of today and over tomorrow morning. So I don't think it's I think it's far from a lost cause. I think now's the time when we get down to work and we say, all right, what is the message? Let's put it out there.
Right. Yeah. And I wasn't inferring that at all. But it was the context of how that example was. That was the front and center. And I agree. We've not lost anything here. And so I guess my rebuttal would be, if they were in the room, what would we want to tell them? I don't know if we would want to tell them, but maybe ask them, what are the things you need to know other than everything that's out there that specifically can address how they operate. I'm not a politician. I don't know how that realm works. So I really can't say this is what you need to know. And there's others in this room that can do that better. But that I would say, what is it that you need from us to be able to do what you need to do to make these changes that we've identified that are important?
This is Matt again. So the website that I referred to with this publication and related information is called Tree Smart Trade, Tree-Smart Trade, and it'll pop right up. So 5 policy actions that will help prevent the next emerald ash borer. Switch to non-solid wood packaging. Minimize new pest outbreaks by expanding early detection and rapid response programs. Augment international pest prevention programs with key trade partners. Restrict or eliminate imports of live woody plants. And tighten enforcement of penalties for non-compliant shipments. Those are very specific. They're very sensible, and those are getting some traction. I would add another one to that for the case of national managing forests in the U.S., which is there needs to be a fix to the fire problem. The fire budget is swallowing the U.S. Forest Service budget. It's gone from like a third to 50% over the last 5 or 8 years, and the capacity for the Forest Service to do anything else, especially research and management, is greatly diminished, and the trajectory is continuing. There needs to be some kind of a fix to the way that forest fires are funded. Right now, it's just coming straight out of the heart of the Forest Service budget, which they use for everything else. So there's another specific policy recommendation that I could make if they were in the room.
I think that's perfect. If we had suggestions like that, that's exactly what we can market. And then we go back to Jeff's comment. Then you just, you actually are in a position to identify who needs to hear this. And so you not only have identified what, you've identified where that needs to go. And to follow on about the fire budget, I talked to somebody in Fish and Wildlife a few years ago, and they said the majority of their budget goes to litigation. not to actually addressing invasive species. It's the litigation. So we need to kind of fix a few things.
Just to add my 2 cents into that, I agree with what Matt said. I think that's a very specific example. I think that if you were to ask why would they be interested in it, the very simple answer would be that climate change and pest biology pose a clear economic and public health threat to the United States. And the economic threat varies from tourism in national parks to the amount of board feet and lumber that can be produced, to post-harvest losses, to food safety. Increased temperature means increased risks of salmonella and E. coli, to food distribution with increased flooding and other major threats that affect how food gets distributed around the country. So there are very strong, very practical reasons why they should care, because often they affect the bottom line and the well-being of the people that they serve. And right now, under current financial and resource conditions, we simply don't have the necessary tools to be able to address many of these uncertainties that are going to affect their constituents.
Yeah, that's great. And I would add to that it can't be a one-time message, because what we see in other groups, they're repeatedly advocating for what they think is important. I mean, this is important to us, and it's arguably important to a lot of people, but they're advocating for other things. So how can we keep that message continually, being sent to the people that we want to make these changes? I mean, these are great points, but how do you keep them going? We've got a couple of comments online.
There are 2 comments, and both of them addressed to you. Steve, this is from Susan Kaler. Have you worked with science policy committee members at WSSA or ASA and other relevant scientific societies? Lee Van Wyken is great. And from Amanda Crump on the Western IPM Center, Steve, your discussion of advocacy really resonates with me. In the West, we have some great supporters, and I think they could be leveraged in a national way. The Western Governors Association is keen on invasives. Representative Gabbard of Hawaii is interested in IPM, and APLU is sponsoring agisamerica.org, which is aimed at members of Congress. The group there is right, though. It's about packaging and making a policy case. Count us in to help.
Great. Yeah, I do know the WSSA group, and I think that's a great opportunity to especially kind of get the message continually out there, that this is I think the points you made, Lou, were great, and also Matt, those policy issues. That's what this group, I think, can do, is to identify what those are and then have them to be sent to these various groups. Yeah, Chung-Yang.
I just want to make a point in that it seems like different the federal agencies have their own funding. For example, DOE, they look at the climate looking at the carbon perspective, for example, and the U.S. Forest Service is looking at forest management perspective, and then USDA clearly looking at the plant pathogens for crop production. So I feel like they may already have some fundings for different agencies, and I think the question is how we can coordinate different agency fundings and have a coherent complementary initiative, and then probably starting from there, we can ask him for increased funding from Congress, for example. So starting from what we have.
Well, so I guess I could say, I'm sure that the other professional organizations also have good outreach branches, and so like Ecological Society of America, I'm sure would also be interested in participating in this, and we could also, in terms of coordinating all these federal agencies, there's the National Invasive Species, what's the C? Council, thank you. It wasn't center. So there are mechanisms for that as well, and we could certainly, you know, rope in Jamie Reeser or rope in that group and see if they would be interested in working on this too.
Yeah, so Nathan Mueller, obviously there's a large interest in reaching the policy community, but you know, coming to this meeting, I feel like I also learned a lot about the lay of the science as far as how these different sub-communities are connecting, and certainly there are larger lessons or themes that can be distilled and communicated also to the broader scientific community to foster continued work at this intersection. And so this gets to, I guess, your previous idea over email about a review article or policy forum or something like that, and sometimes the release of a report or whatever is also a nice mechanism to try and gain press attention or serve as an avenue or something you can distribute to people that here's an authoritative look at the subject, or and here's our 5 key points, so you don't have to read the whole thing if you're not a scientist. But just wanted to stick that out there.
Yeah, I think someone had mentioned that, maybe Jim, on an email that was about, you know, the policy side, but then also, you know, what are the research gaps? Obviously, we haven't hit everything in this 24 to 36 hours. I mean, we've touched on a lot of important things, but there's a lot of areas, there's a lot of individuals that, you know, are not here on the research side that, you know, should be here. And that's another discussion point as far as, you know, this kind of forum, how often does this need to take place? Does it need to be annually? Does it need to be, you know, out in the region on, you know, at the IPM centers? Do they need to coordinate with the climate hubs in the region and say, we're going to put these on, and, you know, and is that something that needs to happen? And you know, so those are the kinds of things that kind of take it from, you know, national to local, regional scales, and you know, but I think that's for us to obviously input on, but I don't know if that's the decision that we make versus our online folks and some others to say, yeah, I'm going to be part of that.
I think if you're really wanting to develop policy in terms of making something that would potentially actually get some funding or make more progress, is we have one grower group here. We don't have the grower representation, the boots on the ground, the people that are actually going to be doing the implementation of what we're talking about or dealing with the consequences of the climate change. We don't have that part of the equation. And without that, how are we going to get policy buy-in? Even if we develop a lot of policy, how are we going to get the buy-in from Congress and the growers? Because I guarantee you, they're going to look at us and say, well, that's a small vote. Whereas the grower community is going to have a lot more influence because they represent a larger mass.
Right, and that's a great point. I don't know if the person that was the grower, I did invite a person to attend, and he might be watching online or he might be out harvesting. You know, that's the issue that we're facing with this kind of thing. They're working, you know, nonstop, and for them to take time out of their schedule to attend or be at something like this is a huge commitment, and there's got to be some incentive for that to happen, because when they go to something like this, there's no reimbursement, and so how do you get them? Do we need to go where they are? I've heard of different, you know, meetings, conferences where going out into the field and meeting them in their field and not necessarily bringing them here, and that's, you know, that's another kind of idea. But definitely that's the group that needs to be involved too. Yeah, Mike.
I would just pick up on that and expand it, include more in the food chain, retailers, wholesalers, you know, people that are sourcing around the world, their supplies are shifting. And Walt and I talked a little bit about it, but I had the opportunity to speak at the American Craft Spirits Association this January. And yes, the tasting room had 400 samples, but they wanted me there because this is important to our business. So I think, you know, think broadly about the whole food system.
Just a response, this is Mark Leeson, just a response to that comment about getting sort of boots on the ground or let's say grassroots opinion. Just kind of an example, we did a number of these sessions preparatory to putting in a CAP proposal to the SCRI, the Specialty Crop Research Initiative, where we visited with groups of growers in different parts of the country. These were all specialty crop growers. I was in company with a sociologist, Lois Morton at Iowa State, and she was doing what she calls concept mapping, which has some nice aspects to it. It's basically a way to represent what growers are thinking, growers' perceptions about the uncertainties in their production system. She has software that she uses to convert those priorities of what they see as their biggest production uncertainties into maps. So concept mapping, it is actually a mapping technique, and the nice thing about it is the output is graphical. So you can actually, a policymaker or hopefully a review panel can look at that and see where growers' priorities are, rather than having to read some fairly tedious academic sentences about, they can actually see, well, here's a big stack of stuff. This is where the growers are, their greatest uncertainty is. So it has a couple of values. One is communicating to policymakers or those who influence policymakers, and the other thing is for agricultural educators to have that sort of finger on the pulse of what their growers may be thinking. So just thought I'd mention that technique, concept mapping it's called. It's quite a beautiful little technique. Nice to have a sociologist on your shoulder though when you're doing that.
There.
So I'm going to probably give a rambling reply here to several things. So number one, if you just use the term farmers, as poorly defined as that is, I mean, that's an increasingly small segment of our population. So from a clout in Washington perspective, it's maybe not as big as what it used to be. Their associations still, I think, have a fair amount of clout, and I think that's the place to engage first, right? So whether it's the commodity groups, Corn Grower, Soybean Association, who, by the way, are all very interested and engaged in this space. We've worked closely with ASA, USB, United Soybean Board, to work on a sustainability certification within our group. The National Corn Growers is working very hard around soil health initiatives. So there's certainly a lot of activity and interest. Farm Bureau Federation, I mean, all those folks, and they all work together very closely. So I think there's a gap there that was identified that probably somebody from those groups would be good to have in this room. I want to highlight a challenge though when we think about particularly row crops or annual crops farmers and climate change. Their world exists on a year-to-year basis. They're growing an annual crop. Their inputs are purchased annually. Their receipts are generated annually. And so their challenge in life is, if they're going to make a living, they want to maximize their productivity on an annual basis. And so from the perspective of thinking 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road and saying, what are the issues that I'm going to face around things like climate change, and how do I adapt today to manage or to mitigate those issues? There's not a lot of thought, right? I mean, their 30-year down the road thinking is, you know, am I going to be able to retire, or am I going to be able to pass the farm on down to my children, things like that. So I think there's a little bit of an issue here of just how do we get them thinking that way. They also don't have the luxury of, as I listened to the various presentations here over the last 2 days, you know, where we can get really specific about a specific species of insect and a specific species of tree, or you name it, right? They don't have that luxury, because in their world, they've got to look at everything that's an assault at their production. So they make lots and lots of decisions, and you know, small changes in the environment to them those happen every day. They happen every year, and so they have to be prepared to deal with those issues. But it's something that's, I think, within their scope of being able to manage, and within the scope of the people that are providing them advice to be able to manage. And so it's a challenge for them to think about, you know, am I going to have more problems with gray leaf spot 10 years from now? they don't know, but they know that they can address them today, and so they take advantage of that opportunity when it presents itself. I think then as you start going up the levels here, and I happen to represent to some extent growers and to some extent the folks that are providing advice to growers, but I also have an industry position here, and I think I'm the only person in the room that works in private industry, and I think there's a potential role for industry in this from a solutions perspective that we probably need to be thinking about, because again, those are the folks that farmers buy their inputs from, that have research capabilities, that are also very interested and concerned about climate change, and have efforts and initiatives around trying to adapt to it. Ben, your drought models, right? I mean, from a company perspective, we've got to be paying attention to that, because it's got to drive the way that we think about product development. And those are the kinds of thoughts that are going on out there in industry right now. So they do have a role, and I think a place in the room. So I apologize, I'm rambling a little bit here, but I think it's a really unique challenge to bring growers along in this conversation, because again, I think just to cap it off, they are very much focused on that year-to-year crop cycle that's really driving their income.
I think, just as we've gone through all these comments about how to address politicians and how to incorporate sociology and how to do a lot of things that we're probably not experts at, we should keep in mind, my idea is that we also keep in mind, different meetings have different purposes, and I don't recall if this meeting had a specific stated objective, but it seems like more of a meeting to consolidate scientific knowledge and collaboration, rather than a meeting that was probably intended to change policy or behavior at a large scale. That sounds like if we can consolidate scientific information, then maybe there's another meeting or two meetings down the road or something where you take those recommendations to Monsanto and to Congress and to other people. So I'm just, so we don't get off the rails with things that we're not experts in, we may want to think about what are real, do we have one or two clear objectives that we want to spend the next half a day, and I don't know what, and maybe Steve has an a clear idea, but there's a lot of stuff we're never going to accomplish today or or whenever, but there's certain things that we've, I think, made great strides to in terms of, I've already, I think, made some new collaborations, and maybe the granting agencies, maybe there's, maybe it's become clear where maybe there needs to be more interagency grants. I know NSF and USDA have some, but if NSF and DOE can, there changes like that, maybe we could affect more easily than, global policy.
Right, and I think that's important. This, and I think I told most of you this is a forum. It's not intended to be a conference. It's not intended to be a workshop. It's not intended to be anything other than a forum to, first of all, identify what's the current state of our knowledge in these two fields. And I think we've addressed that. And then strategize, how do we move forward, whether it's proposing plans, is it, maybe that's too grandiose, maybe it's too pie in the sky, and I think that's where there's enough of us in the room to have this discussion about, okay, what's next, and I think that's been really this part of the meeting now turns into what's the next step. Do we like I've said, is it other forums? Is it, going after a proposal? Is it drafting a paper that's published in a journal? Is it, reaching out to our policy folks and, others? It's kind of a decision of where we want to go next with it. And it's really been to include the online folks. So people that are out there that, want to kind of help direct that. And we've had some really good comments, really good feedback. And so I think that is something that we need to consider as we meet tomorrow morning to kind of work through that. But I think we've definitely met the objectives, and now it's really kind of where do we go from here. So yeah, Jeff.
Hi, this is Jeff Hickey. One of the things that might be worthwhile exploring is a contribution to the next National Climate Assessment in terms of a pest-specific chapter. I'm not sure where that stands in terms of formulating the chapters, but if there's a sector chapter that we could contribute to, or maybe write, that might be a nice venue for promoting to a wide audience.
Jeff Dukes, I'll just say the time window on that is super short this time. I don't know if you've heard this time schedule for the NCA, but there's not going to be a long technical input period. It's more like whatever we've got by like January or something, like, or maybe it's March. That's it. So we could do that, but we've got to be quick.
I just want to second that. I think one of the frustrations that I've experienced over time is that as we see these impacts of climate and pests on production or in natural and managed systems, is that there's no model, there's no synthesis of this in terms of being able to make an estimate of what impact that will have on production or on forestry or any of those things. And I think that's sort of at the time now where we need to start thinking about putting that together and a synthesis and making some kind of estimate, albeit, a rough one, to begin to get a sense of what kind of impact will pests and climate change have going forward.
Yeah, I would agree, and I think that's, as I indicated at the beginning, this area you don't see this kind of group getting together, and so we're here together. I think there's definitely some outputs that we can contribute to, for those that are interested in moving that direction. So, yeah. Mike.
Just another idea. Again, before Nancy left, I got her attention about how to capture what happened here. I mean, we raised the profile of this combination of climate change and pest, and she referred to something called Our Changing Planet. It's a cross-agency publication. Is that? She'll be back here tomorrow. We can talk about it. That might be another way to just get this to a larger agenda and also share what we experience here. We may have a set of recommendations that come out of it.
Steve? So there's this whole concept of climate change and incorporating it into policy. There are a number of groups around this town that are doing that in different sectors. And an area that's beginning to get some real legs is this issue around climate change and national security. And in fact, there was just the presidential executive order, what was it, a week ago, in which the federal agencies, there's a suite of them, that have to come up with, in 90 days, a plan on how they're going to incorporate climate change into national security. And USDA is one of those agencies that's charged with that. And I don't know, we could ask Nancy, I don't know who the USDA representative is to that committee, and whether these kinds of issues around pests or invasive species are included in that dialogue. So that's another place where I think this group could have some input on an area that's getting a lot of attention in this town right now, not only with that executive order, but I've had the opportunity to participate in a forum with the Department of Defense and all the combatant commands around the world, and they are, the forum was on climate change and conflict and the role that plays in their ultimate planning and decision making. And the very same thing was said in that you were talking about the farmers, in which their decision framework is much shorter, in which they have to develop their implementation plans than what we're talking about climate change. But they did acknowledge in that forum that there were two critical, what they call environmental issues, that were really ultimately could have effects on their decisions. One was water and the other was food security. And I don't recall in any of the discussions in that forum the issue of pest and invasive species as part of that food security. So both defense and national security have climate change, you know, they're beginning to address that very directly and see links to, you know, their roles and responsibilities associated with climate change.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I would say, you know, each of us are tapped into networks. We all have our various networks. You know, Liz, you brought up a good one. You sat on a committee that was, you know, connected with DOD. And, you know, I think each of us has that example that if this group coalesces and we come up with something, you know, that's the time to refer to this as, first of all, did you know about this? And second of all, this is an important part of your plan if they didn't include it already. And I think, you know, that's another thing to say, how solidified does this group need to be, you know, to address the things that we're all talking about? Do we, you know, stay together? Do we disperse and go about our way? I mean, that's another, you know, topic of consideration. I know it's an effort to get to these kinds of things. We all are busy. We've got plenty of other things to do. You know, where does it make sense to stay engaged and to stay committed to this, you know, moving forward? And that's probably another thing to think about is what are the next steps? What are the plans that this, you know, that could pertain to this group if we're going to stay at it? Yeah.
I'm not sure the right word I want to use, but I think credibility is not the right word, but maybe authority is. There's more authority coming from a group that represents a lot of different entities and perspectives than there is in individual voices. So I think there's power in something like what you've put together. How best to use that is what would need to be discussed. But I think, from my perspective, there's solid reason to keep a group like this together.
Just another idea on venue, Steve. The Journal of IPM, you know, publishes a number of things that are think pieces, and they're written in you know, pretty down to earth language so that a wide swath of people can understand them. And okay, it's not going directly to policymakers, but it's kind of could be potentially a white paper sort of thing that then can be used in a variety of ways, and that doesn't have a specific deadline as to. I mean, it's we can choose our deadline in order to submit to that. Some really quality stuff is showing up there in sort of thought pieces.
Yeah, that's a good point. You know, we've talked about, well, where should something be? You know, where should it go? And we can have that discussion. But I think, yeah. So keeping, you know, this together is something that I think would be good for us to think about. You know, and obviously we're going to meet again tomorrow morning to kind of work through that. But we've got a little bit of time here, and if there's nothing, no online, I want to give people that haven't said anything an opportunity to speak if they want to. I know there's some individuals that haven't, you know, made a lot of comments, but I don't want to exclude you for just because you haven't been able to say something. So if someone, you know, that hasn't spoken much or at all wants to say something, is there any comment or, and you know, you don't have to, I just wanted to make that opportunity for you if you'd like to.
One of the things that I saw...
Oh, you got to turn on your mic.
One of the things that I saw missing through a lot of the talks, we did a lot of downscaling of bringing these climate models, talking about a global environment, but we didn't do a lot of really real-time decision making. And I know that seems odd when we're talking about climate, but that is still a component of what we're trying to deal with which is how are growers making decisions today and how is that going to change in time? And that deals with the reason that's important, and particularly with the climate change, is that most growers make decisions based on intuition. It's not a completely fact-based decision matrix in which they operate. So that intuition, though, is based on experience that's not going to be valid going forward because of the shift in climate. So how do we get growers to retrain to be able to make the right intuition decisions?
And that was the topic that I think Karen really hit on with some of the things that, grower decision making and connecting the nodes. And the other thing that I heard, and maybe it wasn't from her, but someone said, and maybe it was Andy, they rely on previous years' experience. I forget who said that.
Well, that's experience intuition based, but
it was based on short term, so it wasn't like long term. Because what I was hearing from you is if they're making decisions based on intuition, not fact based, well, they're going to think, well, what did I do last year? Because I'm going to do the same thing if it worked this year, and maybe not accounting for a lot of the changes that are going on.
So I think farmers specifically work within a set of environmental ranges. Like, so there's a normal, right? And I've been advising farmers for too long now. And I think every year at the end of the year I say, boy, that was an unusual year, right? But there's still some normal parameters, right, around temperature norms and around precipitation. But every year has its own set of variations and swings, not just when you look at the average for the year, but even within specific time periods of the growing season or even beyond the growing season. And farmers are used to operating within those because that's just how the world works. And they have to look at what's happening today, what are the predictions for the next few weeks, and how does that impact my management decisions. I agree, there's a fair bit of intuition. I would also say farmers as a group are becoming more and more educated. There's a lot more folks that have gone away to college and returned back to the farm, and so bring a little bit more of an academic understanding to their management. And again, I think, I'm here because I represent a large number of people, and there are people beyond the folks that I represent that their job is to help farmers manage decision making. So it's taking things like, fairly well established IPM guidelines around thresholds and cost of the commodity that they're producing, and using those ideas and those pieces of knowledge to make an input decision. So I think there is that intuition aspect to it. I totally agree with you. But I think there's also a fair level of knowledge-based decision-making that goes on the farm today. And so, I think there's an opportunity for us to continue to educate, not just farmers, but again, the people that make those recommendations. And I think as we look forward, and so if we say 10 years from now or 20 years from now, the temperatures are going to be higher, precipitation may be more, maybe less. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like, but within that growing season, that farmer's still going to be experiencing those departures from the normal, whatever that current normal happens to be. And for a lot of farmers, their normal is that last 30-year history. So I think that'll start to change, but it doesn't necessarily impact the fact that they're going to have to take into account real-time conditions to make real-time management decisions for that annual crop. I think as we talk about forestry management, obviously the timelines lengthen out substantially, right? So I'm coming at this from very much an annual crop, or at least a row crop type perspective.
So we're developing some new decision tools for farmers. One is frost risk, because what we've had in the Northeast is some really unusual springs, and that's going to continue. Also an irrigation scheduler, which wasn't ready for this summer, but that's with more likely intermittent droughts in the summer. When will they need to irrigate? And and I use the term "we" very loosely. These are the scientists at Cornell. The other is a new growing degree day model that has a 15-year sort of average instead of the traditional 30, because that's no longer applies. So I think there's those kind of tools that can be on an app that we can be providing farmers to help them with those decisions.
Right. Well, I guess what I'm getting at is, well, Karen presented a nice summary of how information is flowing within the grower community. It didn't really cover how decisions are made or how growers perceive risk and how they act on that risk. And that's really what's going to be changing, is the risk that's going to be on a year-to-year basis or on a week-to-week basis because of climate volatility and other issues associated with climate change. And then we have them using they're going to be using that intuition that they have to rely back on, because a lot of our decision tools that we're talking about are binary. They're essentially, this may happen, this won't happen, and they're disconnected from each other. And that we have a frost tool, we have a bark beetle tool, we have a powdery mildew tool, but they're disconnected. And that's not how a grower makes a decision. They don't make it in isolation. So how do we bring together these systems and interconnect them to a risk management system that is similar to how growers think? And can we then use that risk management system to retrain to a new norm or a potential new norm?
Go ahead, Karen.
I mean, you've got insurance, you've got land use, water, all of this starts to come into play. I mean, I largely deal with perennial systems.
I want to, Karen wants to make a comment, I'm assuming.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. Well, so the psychology of decision making is really interesting. Well, so if we're thinking about adding an economist, I guess you could kill two birds with one stone and get a behavioral economist. But so talking with people that work in the psychology of decision making, it's really fascinating. Instead of species of pathogens, they've got sort of like species of fallacies that humans are prey to, right? Like the hot hands fallacy, that if you're observing somebody starts to make baskets in basketball, then you just think they'll keep making baskets. And it's, I guess, these traits that are supposed to be just inherent to humans. So it's interesting to think about those kind of structures too. Maybe we could incorporate some of those ideas if we had someone prepared to discuss that, and how farmers might get tripped up in a changing environment too with some of those kinds of cognitive fallacies.
Right, and that was my question to you, is how much information is needed for them to make a decision, and the decision that is going to be useful, or the best decision.
Well, it's not how much information is needed for a decision, because they have to make a decision. They don't have an option. The crop's going, they have to do something, the decision will be made, whether they do or don't act. And so then how do we give them the information that allows them to choose perhaps one of the best optimal solutions? Because rarely in agriculture is there an optimal. There's many optimals. So how do we get at that?
And because we're not getting a bunch of feedback online from a bunch of growers that are saying you guys are all out to lunch, that's where we need them in here. I don't know, do we? Okay. Okay.
Climate impact on food security is a close parallel to Clean Air, Clean Water. Our Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act, useful analogies for how to get comprehensive legislative action to address a multifaceted issue of human impact on natural systems. This group isn't going to write the Climate Food Act 2017, but could serve as impetus and expertise to help politicians and interest groups launch such an effort.
Yeah, good comment. Anyone want to follow up? Keith?
But if it's okay to circle back, before the National Climate Assessment was mentioned, and there's probably some folks here who know more than I do, but within the last week I got an email about how they named the new person who's going to be heading it. I forget his name right now, but there's probably some momentum going there. Also, you might know by law, every 4 years there's supposed to be a national climate assessment comes out that hasn't always been met, but that's why they're ramping up on that timescale. However, in the past few years, there's been discussion, and I don't know how much traction they got on this, where they want to have more of what they would consider a sustained national climate assessment, maybe reducing and offloading a little bit of the idea of coming up with the big books at the end of every 4 years and having a little bit more of a web-based or a more continuing process. So if you have contacts within that sphere, you might see how that's holding up. Also, for this group, where I think there's maybe a challenge and opportunity in the national climate assessment sphere, if I look at it now, yeah, it divides things up by geographic region and also by sector, and it looks like there are 13 sectors right now, but there's not a pest sector, right? So you folks have either the challenge or the opportunity in that you map on to multiple ones. I've been hearing a lot about agriculture in the last 40 minutes or so, but during the meeting, I heard about others, so there might be opportunities there for those who are interested. Water, energy, transportation, agriculture, forests, ecosystems, human health, right? Energy, water, and land, urban, indigenous peoples, land use and land cover change, rural communities, biogeochemical cycles. So that's currently on their website what they list as the sector. So while there's not a pest ones, it seems like there are some alliances within there, but you're not necessarily going to be driving the bus on any of those. So that could be a challenge. My 2 cents.
Great. So Carrie, did you have? Okay, good.
This is Carrie Brown Lima. We've been talking a lot about crops and helping growers get ready for climate change and what they should expect and how they can make better decisions. One of my real interests in being here, and I've really enjoyed it because I've learned a lot from all of you, is have been working with land managers who make decisions about managing invasive species. And we have just recently formed a group of managers to try to identify what are their information needs. What are the things that they need to know to make better decisions? How would knowing more about how climate will impact the movement of invasive species or new species, how would they use that information and how would that change the decisions they make? And so we actually held a workshop in July with managers from all across the Northeast together with the USGS Climate Science Center. And we really found managers, they know they need to plan for climate change, as Matt talked about, leave room for change in management plans. But that's really vague, and they need to really have some more specific recommendations in order to manage our natural resources. So we had people from the Forest Service, we had people from parks, we had from state agencies there to talk about, okay, what the heck do we need to do now? And so I think that this group tends to have a little bit more of an agricultural focus, but really focusing on our natural resources and those kinds of recommendations. And I've specifically, through this group, I've had interest coming in from the Invasive Species Council asking to stay in the loop. They want to be on our listserv, and they really want more information so they can incorporate that into their policy recommendations. So coming from the managers, the forest managers, the water managers, we have a lot of need for information and for more clear recommendations, because you don't have this many opportunities to have experts telling you this is what's happening. They're out there in the field. So we need to kind of condense it into a kind of document that would be easy for them to have access to and to improve their decisions. So.
Yeah, another very important part of it, the policy and the research, and then the application to folks, whether they're working on natural areas or in agriculture. I mean, that's really part of this. And how does that all happen? I don't know. I don't know if we'll come up with some really hard recommendations for doing this, and this, but I think it's an important discussion that needs to happen, and it is happening. Whether it's in this room, whether it's in other institutions across the country. I know most people are working or have some relationship to climate change at some level, some aspect, and so I think this conversation probably is occurring elsewhere and not to the same level or the same degree, but so I would be interested to hear what contribution could be added to it, and I think having these various groups that can tap into that would be good too. So, any final comments? I'm gonna kind of wrap it up here, but does anyone have anything that they just really feel like they need to share with the group and let everyone know about? Anyone online?
One thing Mark did mention about the concept mapping that was done that I actually found quite the most interesting component of it was we had growers from all across the U.S. with very different commodities that involved in it, and all of them were acutely aware of climate change and climate volatility as being something they had to get a handle on. And that was one of the biggest concerns they all had. And this was across both annual type crops as well as perennial crops.
Yeah, I'll just, in the spirit of collaboration, and I used my maximum mapping skills to find the Heavy Seas Ale House, which is just 2 blocks from the hotel. And so you can look that up if you want to
reconvene.
Yeah.
And the beer's actually pretty good. I found it Monday night.
So.
Okay, so with that, I think we're going to wrap it up for today, and we will adjourn. And again, I want to thank everyone for participating, for sharing, what you know, or maybe what you don't know, and really helping us to move this forward. And thank you again for those folks online. Really valuable contribution, and stay in touch with us. There's email. We'll be sending out information through our website, so we'll hopefully keep engaged with those groups too. So thanks again, and we'll be in touch.